Alright guys, so today we're going to be doing another lore video here. The last episode we really covered the beginning of the Vampire Counts, and in this video we're going to cover more of the history of the von Carsteins. The last one we covered the Blood Dragons and the Strigoi. In this one we'll cover more again the von Carsteins. And we'll split this into two separate videos because the von Carsteins have a pretty crazy history with the vampire wars with the empire and whatnot. So we'll really start with Vlad and the kind of beginning of the von Carsteins, and then the second one will go into the second vampire war and the third vampire war as well with Manfred and Con. But everything really kind of starts here in Sylvania. And the last time we left the vampires, it was about 600 years prior. So fast forward 600 years, and we have a count in Sylvania named Otto von Drac, and he is on his deathbed at this point. He's in the capital of Drakenhof, as you guys all know from playing the campaign already, as being the capital of the Vampire Counts area. And he's in this castle, and he's dying of some form of ailment. The book doesn't really go into what the ailment is, but it's pretty heinous. And people keep coming to him and saying, "Hey, you've got to marry off your daughter Isabella to someone to continue the name." And one of the people that was vying the most for his daughter's hand was his hated brother Leopold, and which is just again a terrible name. Leopold, like the type of name of like someone who drives your limo for you when you have to go to the bank or some shit. Not that I drive a limo to the bank, but still. And the Count Otto von Drac kind of more or less curses and makes this kind of like promise of like, I'd rather marry my daughter to a demon than to marry her to you. And the book in the kind of flowery way that all Warhammer fluff is delivered, it kind of talks about it as if like the demon quote unquote answered his prayers, and a count appears at the entrance to Drakenhof Castle, and he's in this black coach, not to be confused with the shitty black coach of the game, but this black coach with like these four nightmare black steeds. And this guy comes up and says, "Hey, my name is Vlad von Carstein. I will marry your daughter." And Otto von Drac kind of looks at this as like, oh, the perfect opportunity. He's already kind of swept up in the charm and the charisma of Vlad von Carstein, and in the same way you would be of a vampire, obviously. But what happens is that he does allow Vlad to marry Isabella, and in turn, that cements him as the ruler of Sylvania, and he immediately just kills Leopold, claims the title, and goes about essentially revitalizing Sylvania. And in the lore of the game, in the tabletop and whatnot, Vlad kind of parallels the Romanian ruler Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, or the true history behind Dracula. And Vlad and Isabella eventually grow into this beautiful romance between each other, as you can see that blossoms into the game, and how their characters kind of have a dynamic together. But Isabella falls ill with the same illness that Otto gets, or her husband, or I'm sorry, her father. And she wants to be given the blood kiss, to be turned into a vampire. And he says, "No, I don't really want to do that. I know what vampirism does to people, and I don't want to see that happen to you." And eventually, though, she succumbs, and Vlad, being Vlad, turns her into a vampire. And it starts this kind of, not a reign of terror, but this dark reign over Sylvania. And it really only takes like 10 years or so, and the entirety of Sylvania falls under more or less like an iron rule. And the citizenry does not hate Vlad. They really like Vlad, because the alternative was Otto von Drac, who was just straight up dick. So essentially, he kind of instills this golden age within Sylvania by using dark means. The book kind of talks about how the undead start to come up from the ground, and they are only actually attacking Vlad's enemies and people that are opposing his rule or opposing his sentiments and his law, more or less. And what he begins to do is go to every single castle and replace the nobility with vampires, more or less. And so now you've got Sylvania, this entire, I think you'd call it a duchy. I can't remember if a count rules a duchy or not, but you've got this entire region then of the empire, which is ruled by vampires. And at this point, it's important to remember that he's doing this, and the empire doesn't know he's a vampire. They just think he's a really disciplined and well-meaning count of the area. And a lot of other areas like Ostermark and neighboring city-states or what have you, duchies, whatever they're considered, actually want him to be considered for the imperial throne. He's a very good ruler at the time. But the thing is that he does this for 200 some years, and people start to get a little suspicious because they've noticed that him and Isabella have been the same people ruling for 200 years, and they haven't changed at all. So that's kind of like the first big sign that there's something weird in Sylvania. On top of that, that same sickness that kills Drock, again, follows through the entire area. And as it kills people, they kind of turn their backs on the gods. And that's an important thing to note, is that the vampires of Warhammer world are weak to the iconography of the cult of Sigmar or the cult of Mor or any of the other of the major gods of the empire, in the same way that they are of any kind of Christian or Catholic symbolism with the crucifix or anything of the sort, or holy water. And eventually they create this cult, the cult of the risen dead. In the book, it's called the cult of the, see if I can actually pronounce this properly, Wiederauferstanden, which means resurrected, quite literally in German. But it's a cult of the arisen dead, and they more or less worship the dead and how the whole process goes about it. So no longer are they gone through like this very Catholic-esque almost burial. They're just kind of simply tossed on the side of the road, and that is kind of how they venerate at the same time. So while all this happens, there's a giant warpstone meteorite that slams into Mordheim, and then that ruins the city entirely, completely destroys it for the most part. And that starts a whole side thing with the ruined city of Mordheim, and people always trying to get warpstone there, because warpstone is kind of like the weapons-grade plutonium of Warhammer. People use it for all sorts of dark arts and all sorts of crazy shit that powers all the Skavens, artillery and all their guns, like the Warpluck Jezzails and all the warp cannons and everything, all powered through warpstone. That's a whole side thing, but Vlad sends his dark minions to go gather some of that warpstone as well, because that allows him to basically supercharge his magic, because the warpstone is initially what allows Nagash to create his 9 books of Nagash and to essentially create all of vampiredom at the same time. But after he kind of does that, things kind of culminate to an ultimate head, which start the first real vampire war. In America, at least, we have Halloween, and we have, All Hallows Eve and whatnot. In Warhammer, they have Geheimnisnacht Eve, so it's kind of the same thing. It's basically what starts the moon Morslieb to have. It's not necessarily like an eclipse, but it's what's called like the blood moon, the chaos moon, and it basically causes an omen of all sorts of bad shit. The chaos gates are a little bit stronger. The winds of magic kind of really screw things up, more or less, and things tend to go terrible. That's when a lot of the beastmen have a lot of their rituals and trials. The wood elves have a special name for it. The high elves have a special name for it. So mutations, all sorts of black arts really go down during this time. And Vlad von Carstein, what he decides to do is, hey, you know what? Terrible, evil time of the year. Why not start a war? So he has this special festivity called the Dance of the Dead. And essentially what happens is he rounds up what's left of the living aristocracy of Sylvania and kills them, just slaughters them to the man. And some of the only people left alive are like his very like personal servant, who's extremely loyal to Vlad, even though he knows that Vlad is a vampire. And what this leads to is that now Vlad is in complete control of Sylvania, and he decides, you know what, with that, I'm going to start this badass war. He uses these warp stones to use a giant incantation from the 9 books of Nagash to raise all of the dead in Sylvania, more or less. And he generates this gigantic army for himself that he uses to march on it's not the Imperium, that's Warhammer 40,000. We'll get to that later when Dawn of War comes out, but he uses it to march on the Empire. And the first real battle of the first Vampire War is the Battle of Essen Ford. And it's just a complete massacre. Like, Vlad just completely sweeps through the Imperial army there. And it's important to remember, too, that there's no real quote-unquote Imperial army. Just like when you start an Empire campaign, you've got Ostermark, you've got Nordland, you've got Middenheim, you've got all these city-states that more or less band together to Altdorf when they need to, but for the most part they're on their own to fend for themselves. And the elector counts are who actually elect a new emperor. So it's not so much that Karl Franz swings out from Altdorf and says, "Hark, look, an evil vampire lord, we must slay him." It doesn't really go like that. The city-states fend for themselves in the event that the emperor doesn't rally as many as he can to his aid. So after that battle, Vlad more or less starts to wreak havoc through everything. And as he gets to you kind of find out that the Vlad is a little bit different than a normal vampire. In fact, at the end of the Battle of Essen Ford, his head is straight up cut off by the Imperial commander that was taken captive. And Vlad's second in command uses this as like this big opportunity to seize control of everything. It's almost like a coup de grace and a coup, as it were. And he comes out of like Isabella's tent with Isabella and says, "Hey, I claim Isabella," who is just like beside herself with sorrow because there's no way she can admit that Vlad's dead. And that kind of plays into the game, as you've seen, where Vlad and Isabella get a bonus together. And that's even in the tabletop. If you have the two models in proximity, they get bonuses. But he says, "Hey, I claim her by right of strength." And Vlad comes out from the crowd saying, "Nah, dog, I got this." Basically kills his former second in command. And that becomes a reoccurring theme of the first Vampire War, is in every single major engagement, something happens to Vlad and he comes back. Like the Battle of Bluthof, he gets like impaled by a crap ton of Imperial Knights, and even like the Count himself actually like runs his runefang through Vlad's heart, and he still appears a couple of days after that. Or the town of Bogenhofen, he gets decapitated by a cannon outright, and he's back an hour later. So he has this signet ring, which is it's the signet ring of the von Carstein family, and in the tabletop it grants him like a ward save, which means anything that would otherwise damage him or hurt him outright, he can roll a save against. It doesn't really personify too well in the actual game here, because that'd be kind of a very OP ring. If every so often, if you kill Vlad, if you didn't end the game quick enough, he'd come back to life, and that would just suck. But as it goes, he realizes that's like pretty much the crux of his power, and he has multiple underlings at this time. We'll get into some of the other ones, but the main one that we're going to talk about is Manfred von Carstein, which you all know from the game already. And he's pretty much like the primogenitor of the Third Vampire War. But he allies up with Grand Theogenist Wilhelm III, because right as Vlad is surrounding Altdorf, the imperial capital, and the Reich, which is the army of the imperial capital, doesn't really know, or can't really defend against this gigantic wave of undead show of force. So Manfred pretty much strikes a deal with Wilhelm, saying, yo, we gotta steal that ring, because I want that ring. Because that's really what Manfred's after, is the ring. He doesn't really care about Vlad von Carstein's desire to be a vampire empire, or emperor. He wants that ring. So Felix Mann is the name of the thief that they hire, who's pretty much like the best thief of the age. And he goes out and steals the ring from Vlad von Carstein. And that just incenses him, because he knows that, okay, now they know that that was the pretty much the crux of my ability to keep coming back. So he launches like a full-out attack on Altdorf, and on the battlements, him and Vlad and Wilhelm square off against each other. And Wilhelm, not being an arch vampire badass count lord, dies. But in his kind of last breath, he throws himself against Vlad, and it tosses them over the battlements. And at that moment, Vlad is skewered onto a stake with Wilhelm on top of him, thus pinning him into the stake and ultimately killing him. And with that, that really kind of ends the first Vampire War. As you've seen in the games, when your lord dies, your army starts to crumble, and that's the same in the tabletops. They don't suffer leadership; they just get hit more harder by that whole portion that shows, oh, they're withering and dying away, and the unbinding, as it's called. We'll get into what happens as a result of the first war, and when we talk more about Conrad and the second Vampire War, and then the third Vampire War in the next video. But I really wanted to lay that groundwork of the von Carsteins, where Vlad really comes from, and how it leads, and how Vlad's fall really leads to Manfred's eventual rise to power in the third Vampire War that we'll find in our next video. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you do have any questions or any comments about Vampire Counts, or want to know more about any other kind of Lorehammer and specific subject, just go ahead and make a comment and let me know. Thanks for joining us, guys, and have a good one.